Matthew chapter 24 is a very interesting chapter. We'll see what we can do with it. Jesus has spoken. Chapter 23 is his pronouncements in the temple courts, and now they leave the temple. And we'll see what happens concerning the temple. And it's the springboard for the discussion that he gives us in chapter 24. I'll read the first 3 verses of Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" They had been next to the temple, around the temple. And this was a very magnificent building, a huge building, an important building. Huge blocks of stone, one upon another. A massive building. And in fact, at this time, it was still being expanded even more. One of the Herods, this ruling family that seemed to be involved in that part of the country at that time, Herod the Great, had started building on the temple about 50 years earlier, and it was still being expanded at this time. That was the center of the Jewish life, was the temple. It was more than just a building. Now we have important buildings. Our courthouse here is very important because it keeps the legal records of our county. We have a capitol in Austin that is our Capitol building, and it's even more important because it covers the state. And we have a Capitol building in Washington, D.C. that's very important because it covers our nation. And they're important, yes, but they're just physical buildings. They represent democracy, they represent civilization and stability. But God's temple here represented more than that. It represented God's covenant with the Jews. This is where they worshiped. This is where God dealt with his people. This was evidence of his love for them, his covenant with them. Everything worked together for them in the temple. So when the disciples pointed these things out to Jesus, boy, this is security. This is strength. This is goodness. This is how much God's with us. Jesus pauses and says, "Not one stone will be left on top of the other." And it's all going to happen. So they ask him about it. When is this going to happen? When is this going to occur? And then also, what about when you come back? When is that going to occur? There's 2 questions here. 2 questions as I understand it. They ask, when is the temple going to be destroyed? When is God going to show his judgment upon us? And number 2, when are you coming back? The coming again of Jesus. When is that going to occur for us to know about? Jesus talks about those 2 events, those 2 questions in chapter 24. And I'm not smart enough to figure out how he does it. Sometimes he talks evidently clearly about when the temple's going to be destroyed. And sometimes he talks about the end times, when he's coming again. And he seems to shift between the 2, and it's hard to know when he's really talking about the temple destruction versus the end times, and he doesn't really tell us and doesn't indicate sort of how he mixes the two together. And I can't figure it out. I try to, you think, well, maybe this paragraph here talks about this time, and you go down the trail a little bit, and nope, it's a dead end, so I go back and go another way. So enough of that. When we see this, we need to realize that we have language here that is sort of over our heads, we might say. It's called apocalyptic language. And apocalypse is the great catastrophes of the end times. As we know, the book of Revelation, the very last book in our New Testament, is apocalyptic, meaning it's allegorical or representing a lot of things that are not literal, as we would say. There's images that we have to interpret, the white horse and all the images that we see in Revelation. Jesus has a little bit of that here. And so when he talks in these great visions of the end times, that's open for interpretation. And that's open for you. I don't know. I just don't know. And all that I'm going to say today is as we go through this, is as I understand it at this point in time. So, if you ask me any questions, all I can say is, I don't know. Let the reader understand. And that's the best I can do. When we think about this, we have a couple of sidelines we want to lay out. A couple of fences, a couple of guardrails we want to know about, that we know for sure. Number one, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. All right? Now, Jesus probably was crucified AD 33 or something like that, early 30s. The Roman armies came to Jerusalem. They sieged it. They starved them out, starved them to death. They were tired of the Jewish revolt, the Jewish problems, and so the Roman armies came in and destroyed Jerusalem. And especially they came to the temple and did throw one stone off the other. None were standing. A terrible catastrophe, but this happened in AD 70, roughly 40 years after Jesus said this prediction. So that's one guardrail we've got. The other guardrail is when Jesus comes again, the end of the world. And Jesus himself will say just a little bit later, I don't know when that is. Only the Father knows. Only the Father knows. And so that's another guardrail. But the conclusion we want to keep in mind before we even start and wrestle with this is that God is in control. God is sovereign. And whenever the end is, he calls us to be ready. He calls us to be faithful. He calls us not to be complacent and lackadaisical, not to think about the ordinary. God calls us to be ready. And that's our message in the end. Let's see what we can do with this as we weave our way through this discussion with Jesus' answer. All right. Verses 4 through 8, Jesus answered. He says, now watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You'll hear wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and a kingdom against kingdom, And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And all these are the beginning of birth pains. All right. Jesus tells us don't get distracted. Don't get misled with things. There will be people come and go that will try to mislead you. There will be calamities in the world and all like that. But he says, don't worry, that's just the beginning of the birth process. As we know, the pains of childbirth, that's the term he uses here. It's going to happen. Don't be misled, he says. Then in verse 9, he says, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. All right, he says there'll be some hard times. You'll be persecuted. Many will fall away from the faith. But he says the one who stands firm in the end will be saved. And that's our theme that we want to conclude with all through this. He says, stay faithful. Stay faithful to the end, and you'll be saved. Okay. Verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now let's pause here just for a moment. Not real sure, but it appears to me that this is dealing with the coming destruction of Jerusalem, because he refers to this abomination of desolation. You see, he says, you're going to see it coming. And when you see it coming, you need to leave town. You need to leave where you are, because there's something physical that's going to happen. If this were the second coming of Jesus, I can run as far as I want to, but it's not going to do me any good. So he does tell people at this time, at least in this section, to flee Judea, flee Jerusalem, go to the mountains, go to the wilderness, get out of town. What happened when the Roman armies did come? They sieged the city, starved people out. And what records we have, it was horrible, horrible, horrible. Friends turned against friends, families turned against families just to survive. People died of starvation, and then the city was taken over. And Jesus is saying, you don't want to go through this. He says, when you see this abomination coming in that's going to desolate your city, run. Now, this was something abhorrent that they would see coming, something that's hated, something that's abominable, something that's terrible. There was a situation, let's see, what was it, about 200 years earlier, where Jerusalem was captured by another country. And the pagans that captured it wanted to irritate the Jews really, really badly. So they set up a pagan altar there in the temple grounds. And they sacrificed a hog on the altar. And you see, the Jews were forbidden to eat pork through the Old Testament laws, and so that was unclean, much less to have a hog sacrificed on an altar there in the temple. This was an abomination. This was terrible. And so they may have had this in their mind. When you see this abomination of desolation coming, you need to leave. When the Roman armies marched in, the man on the front had a pole, a standard, with their banner, with their flag, with a Roman eagle on it. And it could be that this ensign, this emblem, the eagle, was this abomination of desolation sign or banner that they had. And when you see the armies coming in with their standard bearer and their flag, you need to leave town. You need to leave. That's probably what he may have been referring to here. Now, if you read this in verse 15, he said, now this abomination of desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. And then he puts in parenthesis, let the reader understand. In other words, I'm talking in code language. You figure it out. You get what I mean? You know what I'm saying, right? Or various phrases like that. So, if we were talking in code today along these lines, our flag, sometimes we call the stars and stripes, right? All right. Now, stars, we have stars in the sky, we have a star on our lapel or whatever. And we know what stripes are, stripes on the road, stripes here, stripes there. But put together in a certain sequence of words, the stars and stripes means our flag. And so if we were trying to speak in code to, our fellow Americans, we'd say, now when you see the stars and stripes, you know what I'm saying? Then you need to go. The armies are coming. And maybe this is what Jesus is trying to say. When you see this abominable banner, whatever, abomination of desolation, let the reader understand you need to go. All right, enough of that, but it's going to be a terrible situation.
Sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
The King James reads, whoso readeth, let him understand.
Yes. Let the reader understand. Figure it out. And that's what we need to do. We need to, I'll let everybody do that on your own. I can't. All of this. Okay. All right. Any other comment or question here?
Well, the eagle was an unclean animal, too.
Right. An eagle or vulture was an unclean animal. Yes. Dr. May?
Hardest concepts in all of science, and I'm just throwing this out as we think, is the concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
And we all grew up with the scientific, what do we call a day?
Mm-hmm.
That's the time it takes our planet to make one revolution. A year is the time it takes our planet to go around the sun one time. That concept, and our understanding in our brain that we were raised since we were little kids, exists only in Gatesville, Texas, on this planet. If you're on Mars or Jupiter or somewhere else in the universe, does not pertain. So that's why it's hard for us to sometimes we start talking days and stuff, but we forget that's just here.
Okay.
Where God is, a day is entirely different
Yes.
and doesn't exist. So that's the hard part about it.
Yes.
Is we get caught up in the time. And that's why your comment earlier, and it's the one to carry away, is be prepared. Be Christian Boy Scouts.
Yes.
Be prepared. And then time is irrelevant.
Exactly. Time is something God created that he does not live in. So when Jesus looks to the future, and time is immaterial. And he sort of mixes it up here. And we think, well, Jesus, be more clear. Well, that's his business. He said what he wanted to say to us. And yes, as he sees things, time is immaterial. And that's what we need to come down, as you say, be prepared. Time is immaterial whether we live another year or another 10 years, 20, 30 years. Time is immaterial. We need to be prepared. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. Verse 22 here through 28. Now, if those days had not been cut short, no one would have survived. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false messiahs, false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is, out in the wilderness," do not go out, or "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Again, Jesus tells us, don't be deceived. Don't follow after anything false. There will be false messiahs, false prophets here and there. Don't believe it. He says, I just want you to know that the coming of the Son of Man will not be missed. You cannot miss it. Just as a lightning flash in a dark night, you can't miss it, he would say. And so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Verse 29. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. All right, Jesus uses some of this apocalyptic language. He says that the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, heavenly bodies will be shaken. This cosmic disruption, this catastrophe of the end is his language here. Throughout the Old Testament, such language is used when God breaks into the world in a special way and does a special, sometimes action, special judgment. In fact, if you remember from Acts chapter 2, when the Holy Spirit came on the apostles and they spoke in different tongues, and then Peter got up to speak the first gospel sermon in Jerusalem, the great sermon on the day of Pentecost. People were so disturbed. What's going on here? Peter quotes from the Old Testament. And so this is what was predicted. The moon will turn to blood, the sun will not shine, and the stars will fall from the sky, and this great cosmic calamity will come upon you when I pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. So this is this kind of language that is open to interpretation that Jesus uses here, that God will break in and do something very, very special. And some of these images here, the fig tree, elsewhere here, some of these things could be interpreted to mean other things. I'll let you deal with that. That's up to you. I am not smart enough to figure all that out. But Jesus says that God is going to break into the world in a wonderful way, and that we need to be ready. He says, heaven and earth will pass away. The physical things are not eternal. But my words, what I say here, will never pass away. Okay? Verse 36. But that day or the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. And that is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, and one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. The coming of Jesus will be unexpected to the great majority. That's a fact that he tells us. It's a fact that we know logically, but it's a fact that's hard to absorb into our lives. But he says it's just going to be like the time of Noah. Noah built the ark. People made fun of him and asked him what's going to go on and all that. They lived their life day in and day out, as we see here, eating, drinking, carrying on, marrying, all that. Knew nothing about what was happening until when it started raining. Took them away. And that's how it's going to be when the Son of Man comes. We're going to be doing our regular work, be it in the field or the mill, whatever, as he says here. But it's going to happen. And he says, be prepared. If you knew your house was going to get broken into, you'd stay at home and guard it, right? That's his image here, his analogy. So you must also be ready, Verse 44, because when the Son of Man comes, it'll be at an hour when you do not expect him. He tells us to be faithful. To be faithful. In other words, Dr. May, time is not important. Time is not important. Your faithfulness is important. Okay. The last little paragraph here is sort of a little parable about a householder has, servants that think the householder will never come back, so we'll just goof around. Verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants of his household, to give them their food in the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. And then the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. And he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus puts it in a little parable that we all understand. I'm a good, faithful servant. Nobody's watching me, but I do my job. Wonderful. I'll be rewarded with good things. But another servant, I don't think my master's ever going to come back. He's not going to see me goofing around and I'll just lay off. No, the master's going to open the door and walk in real unexpected. And he'll take care of that slothful servant that violated his trust. And he says, that's the way it'll be at the end. And there will be reward, there will be punishment. Be prepared. Now, in looking at this in a conclusion, I have to ask the question, Jesus, why weren't you more clear? Please, couldn't you have been more clear about these issues of when the temple would be destroyed, and especially when you're coming again? All right. Well, Jesus coming again is up to God. God alone. God the Father. And we're his servants. God is sovereign. God is almighty. And whatever God wants to do, I'm all for. How he wants to do it, I'm all for. And when he wants to do it, I'm all for. I am nothing but a servant that's waiting for my master's return, as he just said in the parable. Time is immaterial. I can't figure out how Jesus looks into the future and tries to explain when some things are going to happen. Can't quite do that. But all I do know is that God calls us to think about the living, not the dead. You remember just earlier, Jesus was asked this riddle about what's going to happen when in the afterlife a woman has 7 husbands. So whose husband is she going to be in the afterlife? And Jesus says, it doesn't matter. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're alive. I am the God of the living, not the dead. You worry about what's here, what's now, your life, and let God take care of the dead, okay? Maybe that's what Jesus wants us to know, is let's look at him as the living God for us right now. Be prepared, and whatever God has for us in the future, he'll take care of it. Now, that's a very brief summary in general. Any comment or question as we